Welcome to another deep dive into the darkest corners of history. Today, we are unpacking a case that quite literally shattered the innocence of an entire nation. It is a story so incredibly massive, so universally shocking at the time, that it earned the title of America's first true crime of the century. We are, of course, talking about the 1932 kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old infant son of the most famous man on the planet. It really is impossible to overstate just how famous Charles Lindbergh was in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Today, we have celebrities, we have movie stars, we have internet sensations, but Lindbergh was something entirely different. He was viewed almost as a mortal god. When he completed the first solo, non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris in 1927 in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, he became a global hero overnight. So when news broke that his firstborn son had been stolen from his crib in the dead of night, it was as if a crime had been committed against every single family in America. The collective trauma and the absolute media frenzy that followed were unprecedented. Exactly. This wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a national crisis. President Herbert Hoover himself was briefed, and later Franklin D. Roosevelt would be involved. The FBI, which was then a relatively young organization under J. Edgar Hoover, scrambled to find its jurisdiction in the matter. The story of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping involves a massive ransom, shadowy figures meeting in dark cemeteries, a trial that became a grotesque circus, and a pioneering use of forensic science that changed law enforcement forever. But to truly understand how this tragic event unfolded, we have to go back and look at the intense, suffocating pressure of the Lindberghs' lives leading up to that fateful night in March 1932. To understand the backstory, we have to start with the sheer magnitude of Charles Lindbergh's fame. After his 1927 flight, Lindbergh couldn't walk down a street anywhere in the world without being mobbed. He was given parades, medals, and endless accolades. In 1929, he married Anne Morrow, the daughter of the American ambassador to Mexico. They were considered the absolute golden couple of their era. But the press would not leave them alone. Reporters camped outside their homes, photographers harassed them constantly, and they were desperate for privacy. In June 1930, Anne gave birth to their first child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., affectionately known as Charlie. The public obsession only intensified with the birth of the baby, whom the press immediately dubbed the Eaglet. That suffocating fame is exactly what drove the Lindberghs to seek extreme isolation. They wanted a fortress where they could raise their son away from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. They purchased nearly 400 acres of heavily wooded, incredibly remote land in the Sauerland Mountains near Hopewell, New Jersey. They began constructing a sprawling, beautiful, but highly isolated estate. By early 1932, the house was mostly finished, but the grounds were still barren and muddy. The family usually spent their weekdays at the Morrow family estate in Englewood, New Jersey, and only traveled to the unfinished Hopewell house on weekends. But the weekend of February 26, 1932, would be the exception that set the stage for tragedy. That's a crucial detail. That weekend, little Charlie developed a cold. Because the baby was sick, Anne decided they shouldn't travel back to Englewood on Monday as they usually did. They decided to extend their stay at the Hopewell house through Tuesday, March 1st. This was a highly unusual disruption to their normal routine, a fact that would later fuel decades of conspiracy theories about how the kidnappers knew the family would be at the remote estate on a Tuesday night. The house itself was staffed by a very small group of trusted individuals: Betty Gow, the baby Scottish nursemaid, Oliver Whately, the butler, and his wife Elsie Whately, the cook. Because it was a Tuesday, some of the construction workers and other regular staff were not present. And the environment around the house that Tuesday night was incredibly bleak. It was cold, damp, and highly windy. The weather was miserable. Inside, however, they were just trying to care for a sick toddler. The nursery was located on the second floor of the house. It had 3 windows. One of those windows had a shutter that was notoriously warped and couldn't be locked properly from the inside. A small but absolutely devastating architectural flaw. As evening approached on March 1st, 1932, the household settled into its evening routine, completely unaware that someone was lurking in the dark woods outside, carrying a crudely constructed 3-piece wooden ladder. Let's walk through the timeline of that terrible night in agonizing detail. At around 8 p.m., Betty Gow, the nursemaid, prepared little Charlie for bed. Because of his cold, she rubbed a generous amount of Vicks Vapor Rub on his chest. She dressed him in a special sleeping suit that Anne had made herself, pinning it to his blankets to keep him from kicking them off in the cold room. She closed the windows, although the warped shutter remained a problem, and left the room. Downstairs, Charles Lindbergh was working in his library, directly below the nursery. Anne was resting in her bedroom after having a light dinner. At roughly 9:10 p.m., Charles Lindbergh heard a sharp, distinct noise from outside. He later described it to investigators as sounding like the wooden slats of an orange crate breaking. In the howling wind, he didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just a branch or some loose construction material snapping in the storm. He went back to his reading. Then, at 10 p.m., Betty Gow returned to the nursery to check on the baby and change his diaper. She opened the door, and the room was entirely quiet. She walked over to the crib and reached out to feel for him. Her hands met empty blankets. Initially, panic didn't set in. Betty assumed that Anne or Charles had taken the baby into one of their rooms. She walked down the hall to Anne's bedroom and asked if she had the baby. Anne said no. Betty then rushed downstairs to the library and asked Charles if he had taken Charlie. When Charles replied that he hadn't, the terrifying reality instantly hit him. He ran up the stairs to the nursery, looked at the empty crib, and then scanned the room. On the windowsill of the window with the warped shutter, he saw a plain white envelope. He immediately ordered everyone not to touch it, suspecting it was a ransom note. He turned to his wife and said the words that would echo through history, "Anne, they have stolen our baby." Lindbergh grabbed a rifle and, along with the butler, Oliver Whately, rushed outside into the freezing dark to search the grounds. They found nothing but mud and howling wind. The local Hopewell police were called, led by Chief Harry Wolfe, and soon the New Jersey State Police, headed by Colonel Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., arrived on the scene. When the police finally examined the envelope on the windowsill, they found a note filled with bizarre spelling and grammatical errors. It demanded $50,000, specified the denominations of the bills, warned against involving the police, and featured a highly unusual symbol at the bottom: 2 interlocking circles drawn in blue ink, with a red circle in the center, and 3 holes punched through the design. The crime scene investigation that night was a total disaster by modern standards. The local police, the state police, and soon a small army of reporters absolutely trampled the grounds. Outside the nursery window, investigators did find deep indentations in the soft mud where a ladder had been placed. They also found a single partial footprint, but it was impossible to measure accurately before it was destroyed by the sheer volume of people walking over it. More importantly, roughly 60 feet from the house, they found a wooden extension ladder. It was completely homemade, crudely built in 3 sections, and one of the wooden rails was sharply split right where the top and middle sections connected. This perfectly explained the cracking noise Lindbergh had heard at 9:10 p.m.
The news of the kidnapping hit the wire services within hours. By the next morning, the Lindbergh estate was practically under siege by thousands of reporters, sightseers, hot dog vendors, and curious onlookers. It was a bizarre, carnival-like atmosphere outside a home experiencing a profound tragedy. Inside, Charles Lindbergh effectively took absolute control of the investigation. Despite Colonel Schwarzkopf technically being in charge, no one was going to tell the great Charles Lindbergh what to do. Lindbergh decided he would pay the ransom and negotiate directly with the kidnappers, actively sidelining the police to prevent them from setting traps that might endanger his son's life. He even used intermediaries connected to the criminal underworld, believing mobsters might have snatched the child.
That underworld angle is fascinating. Even Al Capone, who was sitting in a Chicago jail cell awaiting transfer for tax evasion, offered a massive reward and the use of his syndicate to find the baby, purely for the public relations boost. But the real breakthrough in contact came from a totally unexpected source. A 72-year-old retired schoolteacher in the Bronx named Dr. John F. Condon wrote a letter to the Bronx Home News, a local paper, offering his life savings and his services as a neutral intermediary if the kidnappers would reach out to him. Incredibly, the kidnappers accepted. A letter arrived at Condon's house containing the secret interlocking circle symbol, authorizing him to act as the go-between. He adopted the nickname Jafsy based on his initials, JFC. Jafsy began a series of incredibly tense, deeply strange communications with the kidnappers through newspaper classified ads. This culminated in 2 face-to-face meetings in New York cemeteries. The first meeting took place at Woodlawn Cemetery, where Jafsy met a shadowy figure hiding in the darkness who called himself John. John had a thick German or Scandinavian accent. He promised the baby was safe on a boat, but demanded proof that Lindbergh was ready to pay. To prove his own identity, John promised to send the baby sleeping suit. Days later, a package arrived in the mail containing the very sleeping suit Betty Gao had pinned the baby into on the night of the kidnapping. Lindbergh positively identified it. The family was convinced that Joffe was talking to the real kidnappers. This led to the final, devastating drop. On April 2, 1932, Joffe went to St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, accompanied by Charles Lindbergh, who waited in a car nearby. Joffe met Cemetery John again and handed over a custom-made wooden box containing exactly $50,000 in gold certificates. The serial numbers of all these bills had been painstakingly recorded by the Treasury Department. In exchange for the massive sum of money, John handed Joffe a small note. The note claimed that little Charlie was alive and well, being held by 2 innocent women on a boat called the Nellie, supposedly anchored near Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Lindbergh immediately flew his plane over the waters off Massachusetts, frantically searching every inlet and cove for a boat matching the description of the Nellie. He searched for days, refusing to give up hope, but there was no boat. It was a cruel, devastating lie. The ultimate tragic conclusion to the kidnapping arrived on May 12, 1932, 72 days after the baby went missing. A truck driver named William Allen pulled over on a road just 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh estate. He walked into the nearby woods to relieve himself and made a horrific discovery. He found the badly decomposed, partially scavenged remains of an infant half buried in the dirt. The discovery shattered the nation. The body was identified as Charles Lindbergh Jr. by the distinctive overlapping toes on his right foot and the remnants of the shirt Betty Gao had put on him on the night of the kidnapping. The autopsy revealed that the child had not been alive on any boat. In fact, he had likely died the very night he was kidnapped. The skull was severely fractured, indicating a massive blow to the head. The prevailing theory formulated by investigators was that the kidnapper, while carrying the baby down the crudely built ladder, experienced the terrifying moment when the wood split. The kidnapper dropped the infant, resulting in the fatal head injury, hurriedly buried the body in a shallow grave just miles away, and then proceeded with the cruel charade of extorting $50,000 from a grieving family.
With the discovery of the baby's body, the kidnapping investigation instantly transformed into a massive nationwide murder hunt. The problem was that the trail had already gone completely cold. The crime scene was ruined, the kidnapper had the money, and Cemetery John had vanished into thin air. The authorities had 2 major pieces of evidence: the crude wooden ladder left at the estate and the list of serial numbers from the $50,000 in ransom money. For over 2 years, police chased ghost leads, investigated servants, and monitored bank deposits, but made absolutely zero progress. But then, broader economic history unexpectedly intervened and cracked the case wide open. That's right, the Great Depression was ravaging the country, and in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard. He issued an executive order requiring all citizens to turn in their gold certificates for standard paper currency. Suddenly, the fact that the Lindbergh ransom had been paid entirely in gold certificates became the greatest asset the investigators had. While normal money could easily blend in, spending a gold certificate after the recall deadline drew immediate suspicion. Police circulated booklets containing the serial numbers of the ransom bills to banks and businesses across the country. Slowly, sporadically, a few bills began to pop up, mostly in New York City, specifically in the Bronx and Manhattan. The decisive moment finally arrived in September 1934. A man driving a dark Dodge sedan pulled into a gas station in Manhattan and paid for a few gallons of gas with a $10 gold certificate. The gas station manager, a man named Walter Lyle, was suspicious of the obsolete currency. Operating on a hunch, he took his pencil and quickly jotted down the car's New York license plate number directly onto the margin of the bill. When that bill was deposited at the bank, a teller checked the serial number against the Lindbergh list. It was a match. The police traced the license plate number back to a house in the Bronx, leading them directly to a 35-year-old German immigrant and carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. The police staked out Hauptmann's home and arrested him on September 19, 1934. When they searched him, they found another $20 ransom bill in his wallet. But that was just the beginning. Investigators tore his house and garage apart. Hidden inside the walls of his garage, stuffed into a customized oil can, and buried in jars under the floorboards, they discovered over $14,000 of the Lindbergh ransom money. It was the smoking gun. Hauptmann was a skilled carpenter, he matched the physical description of Cemetery John, he had a German accent, and he possessed a massive chunk of the blood money. To the authorities and the public, the case was definitively solved. But Hauptmann fiercely maintained his innocence. He claimed that the money actually belonged to a friend and former business partner named Isidore Fish.
According to Hauptmann, Fish had left a shoebox with him for safekeeping before traveling back to Germany in 1933. Hauptmann claimed he didn't know there was money in the box until a leak in the roof damaged it, at which point he found the gold certificates. Because Fish owed him money, Hauptmann said he simply decided to start spending it. The major flaw in this defense, which the press mocked relentlessly as the Fish story, was that Isidor Fish had died of tuberculosis in Germany in early 1934 and conveniently could not be questioned to corroborate Hauptmann's claims. Despite his protests, Hauptmann was indicted for capital murder, and the trial was set for January 1935 in the small town of Flemington, New Jersey. What followed was completely unprecedented. It was dubbed the trial of the century, and it turned Flemington into an absolute circus. Over 700 reporters and photographers descended on the town. Celebrities, politicians, and socialites bribed their way into the tiny courthouse to watch the spectacle. Vendors sold miniature wooden ladders as souvenirs on the courthouse steps. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution, led by the brilliant and aggressive David Wilentz, mounted an overwhelming, multifaceted attack against Hauptmann, utilizing physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and pioneering forensic techniques.
The forensic evidence was truly groundbreaking for the era. The most compelling testimony came from Arthur Kohler, an expert wood technologist from the United States Forest Service. Kohler had spent years obsessively tracking the wood used to build the kidnap ladder. He testified that the ladder was built using wood sourced from a specific lumber mill in South Carolina, shipped to a specific yard in the Bronx, exactly where Hauptmann had bought lumber. Furthermore, Kohler demonstrated to the jury that a specific piece of wood on the ladder, known as rail 16, had identical nail hole patterns and grain structure to a floorboard found missing from Hauptmann's own attic. He even matched the tool marks on the ladder to a specific handplane found in Hauptmann's tool chest. Beyond the astonishing wood evidence, there was handwriting analysis. Multiple highly credentialed handwriting experts took the stand and confidently declared that the bizarre misspellings, specific letter formations, and unique phrasing in the ransom notes perfectly matched Bruno Richard Hauptmann's handwriting samples. They pointed out his tendency to hyphenate words like New-York and use inverse spellings. Additionally, Dr. John F. Condon, JAFC, took the stand and dramatically pointed directly at Hauptmann, identifying him as the Cemetery John he had met in the dark. Even Charles Lindbergh himself testified, stating under oath that he recognized the voice calling out in the cemetery 3 years earlier as belonging to the man sitting at the defense table. Hauptmann's defense attorney, Edward Riley, who was heavily funded by the Hearst newspaper empire in exchange for exclusive rights to Hauptmann's story, put up a spectacularly disorganized defense. Riley tried to suggest that the kidnapping was an inside job, accusing the Lindbergh servants, and even tried to paint the entire investigation as a massive police frame-up. Hauptmann took the stand in his own defense, but he was battered under intense cross-examination by prosecutor Wilentz. Hauptmann came across as evasive, arrogant, and unable to clearly explain why he had the money or why his handwriting matched the notes. After a grueling trial, the jury deliberated for just over 11 hours. On February 13, 1935, they returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The mandatory sentence was death by the electric chair. Hauptmann's legal team filed multiple appeals, reaching all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but every appeal was systematically denied. Even the governor of New Jersey, Harold Hoffman, had secret doubts about the case and granted a temporary reprieve to conduct his own shadow investigation, believing it was impossible for one man to have executed the kidnapping alone. But Hoffman's efforts yielded no new actionable evidence. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. Until his very last breath, he maintained total innocence, refusing an offer of life imprisonment in exchange for a confession. The execution of Hauptmann closed the legal case, but the consequences of the crime rippled throughout American history. The sheer horror of the crime prompted the United States Congress to pass the Federal Kidnapping Act, universally known as the Lindbergh Law. This crucial piece of legislation made kidnapping a federal offense if the victim was transported across state lines, allowing federal agencies like the FBI to immediately intervene and utilize their vast resources, rather than leaving these complex cases to unequipped local jurisdictions. It fundamentally changed the operational power of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. Furthermore, the relentless, suffocating press intrusion completely broke the Lindbergh family. Fearing for the safety of their second son, John, Charles and Anne fled the United States in late 1935, seeking secret refuge in Europe just to escape the public eye. Yet, despite the conviction, the execution, and the new laws, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping remains a fertile breeding ground for historical debate and conspiracy theories. Many modern historians and forensic analysts point out massive flaws in the prosecution's case. The police were under immense pressure to find a culprit, leading to accusations that they tampered with evidence, specifically regarding the wood in Hauptmann's attic. Witnesses like Joffe frequently changed their stories before trial. More importantly, the logistical reality of a single man navigating that remote terrain, climbing a crude ladder, extracting a heavy toddler, and leaving no trace inside the house seems incredibly improbable to many experts. Some theorists argue that Hauptmann was merely an extortionist who stumbled upon the opportunity, or part of a larger ring, while others propose incredibly dark theories, suggesting Lindbergh himself was somehow involved in an accidental death that he subsequently covered up to protect his godlike public image. Whatever the absolute truth of that freezing night in Hopewell might be, the fact remains that the Lindbergh baby kidnapping permanently altered the American psyche. It stripped away a layer of societal innocence, proving that if the child of the greatest hero in the world was not safe in his own crib, absolutely no one was safe. It revolutionized forensic science, empowered federal law enforcement, and left behind a deeply tragic narrative of a broken family, a controversial execution, and a mystery that, nearly a century later, still refuses to be completely put to rest. The echoes of those broken wooden slots in the New Jersey wind will forever serve as a chilling reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature and the terrifying price of unparalleled fame. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive exploration of America's true first crime of the century. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the historical true crime cases that shaped the world we live in today. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next episode. We left off with the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man in the world, was frantically searching his Hopewell, New Jersey estate. The local police were on their way, but the crime scene was already being compromised. And then there was the note. Yes, the ransom note. It was left on the windowsill of the nursery. It was a poorly handwritten letter, riddled with spelling and grammatical errors, demanding $50,000. But the most crucial detail was the symbol at the bottom: 2 interlocking blue circles, a red circle in the middle, and 3 square holes punched through it. That symbol was meant to authenticate any future communication from the kidnappers. But let us talk about the crime scene itself. When the New Jersey State Police arrived, led by Colonel Norman Schwarzkopf, they found a ladder leaning against the house, right below the nursery window. One of the rungs was broken. The ladder is one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence in this entire case. It was a homemade wooden extension ladder. It was crudely built, yet cleverly designed to fit into a car. But the police immediately started making mistakes. The ladder was handled by multiple people before any attempt was made to check for fingerprints. The entire scene was a nightmare for forensic investigators, even by the strict standards of that year. The Lindbergh estate was quickly overrun by reporters, sightseers, and helpful friends. They trampled the grounds, destroying potential footprints and evidence. The local police, frankly, were completely out of their depth dealing with a crime of this magnitude, especially one involving a global icon. The pressure was unimaginable. Lindbergh, accustomed to taking charge and flying solo, basically took over the investigation. He sidelined the police and insisted on dealing with the kidnappers directly. This is a crucial point because it completely altered how the investigation was handled. He was desperate to get his son back, and you cannot blame him for that. But his interference led to some bizarre developments. Enter John Condon, a retired Bronx school teacher who goes down in history as Joffe.
Condon is such a bizarre character in this tragedy. He wrote a letter to a Bronx newspaper offering an additional $1,000 of his own money and volunteering to act as a messenger. Incredibly, the kidnappers accepted his offer. They sent him a letter containing the secret symbol, proving they were the ones who took the baby. This led to a series of clandestine communications through newspaper classified ads, with Condon using the pseudonym Joffe. The tension was building. Condon actually had 2 personal meetings with a man who claimed to be the kidnapper. He called this man Cemetery John because they met in dark cemeteries in the Bronx. The first meeting took place at Woodlawn Cemetery. Cemetery John had a German accent and stayed in the shadows. He provided Condon with the infant sleeping suit as proof of identity. Lindbergh confirmed it belonged to his son. This convinced Lindbergh and Condon that they were dealing with the real kidnappers and that the child was still alive. So the decision was made to pay the ransom, $50,000 was a massive sum during the Great Depression. The money was assembled, but with a critical caveat. The authorities recorded the serial numbers of every single bill. Most of the money was paid in gold certificates, which were about to be withdrawn from circulation, making them easier to track. The drop happened on April 2nd at St. Raymond Cemetery. Condon handed over a wooden box containing the money to Cemetery John. In return, Condon was given a note stating that the child was on a boat called the Nellie off the coast of Massachusetts. Lindbergh personally flew over the area searching for this boat. He scoured the coastline for days, but there was no boat. It was a cruel lie. The realization that they had been duped must have been absolutely devastating. It gets much worse. On May 12th, just over 2 months after the kidnapping, the unthinkable happened. A truck driver named William Allen pulled over to the side of a road about 4 miles from the Lindbergh estate. He walked into the woods and discovered the badly decomposed body of a toddler. It was Charles Lindbergh Jr. The coroner determined that the child had been dead for roughly 2 months. The cause of death was a massive fracture to the skull. It is widely believed that the infant died the very night of the kidnapping, perhaps accidentally dropped when the ladder rung broke during the escape. The nation mourned. The kidnapping of a famous American child had turned into a brutal murder. The focus of the investigation violently shifted from a rescue mission to a manhunt, and the only real lead they had was the ransom money. The serial numbers of the gold certificates were distributed to banks and businesses across the country. But months turned into years. Occasionally, a ransom bill would turn up, usually in the New York area, but by the time the police tracked it down, the trail was cold. The investigation seemed stalled, but the police kept tracking the gold certificates, waiting for the kidnapper to make a mistake. That mistake finally happened more than 2 years later, during the autumn season. A man pulled his Dodge sedan into a gas station in Manhattan and paid for his fuel with a standard gold certificate. The gas station attendant was suspicious of the old bill, so he wrote the vehicle license plate number on the margin of the bill. When the bank processed that bill, they realized it was from the Lindbergh ransom. They immediately contacted the authorities. The police traced the license plate to a younger German immigrant named Bruno Richard Hauptmann, living in the Bronx. This was the massive breakthrough they had been waiting for. The police arrested Hauptmann. When they searched him, they found another folded ransom bill in his wallet, but that was just the beginning. They tore apart his house and garage, and hidden inside the garage, they found over $14,000 of the Lindbergh ransom money.
Hauptmann claimed he was innocent. He had a story, of course. He said a friend and business partner named Isidor Fish had left the money with him before returning to Germany. Fish had subsequently died in Germany, and Hauptmann claimed he was just keeping the money because Fish owed him for an investment. The police were not buying the story about Isidor Fish. They started building a case against Hauptmann, and the evidence seemed overwhelming. First, there was John Condon. Condon identified Hauptmann in a police lineup as the man he met in the cemetery. He said Hauptmann was Cemetery John. Then there was the handwriting analysis. Multiple experts compared his handwriting to the ransom notes, and they concluded it was a match. They pointed out unique spelling errors, like spelling the given word's signature with the letters reversed at the end, which appeared in both his personal writings and the ransom notes. But the most damning evidence of all, the piece of evidence that truly captivated the public, involved that broken wooden ladder. The police brought in an absolute pioneer in the field of wood analysis, Arthur Kohler from the Forest Products Laboratory. His work was revolutionary for that era. Kohler meticulously examined the ladder. He determined the exact type of wood, the specific tools used to cut it, and even traced the lumber back to the specific mill in South Carolina and then to a lumber yard in the Bronx near his home. But the real bombshell was rail 16. Exactly, rail 16 was one of the upright pieces of the ladder. Kohler proved that rail 16 perfectly matched a missing floorboard in the attic of his rented apartment. The nail holes aligned perfectly, the grain of the wood matched perfectly. It was undeniable proof that the ladder used to kidnap the baby was built using wood taken directly from his own home. The massive criminal trial began in January in Flemington, New Jersey. It was an absolute media circus, immediately dubbed the trial of the century. The small town was flooded with reporters, celebrities, and curious onlookers. Souvenir vendors sold miniature wooden ladders outside the courthouse. It was a spectacle unlike anything the American legal system had ever seen. The prosecution presented a tight, circumstantial case based on the money, the handwriting, and the wood. The defense argued that the police had framed Hauptmann, planting the evidence and coercing witnesses.
Hauptmann himself took the stand, maintaining his innocence and sticking to his story about Isidor Fisch, but the jury did not believe him. On February 13th, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was found guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals and even an unexpected intervention by the governor of New Jersey, who had doubts about the case, Hauptmann was finally executed in the electric chair on April 3rd the following year. To his dying breath, Hauptmann claimed he was innocent. While most historians believe he was involved, haunting questions linger today. Was he acting completely alone during this complicated crime? Many suspect there were accomplices who were never caught. The Lindbergh kidnapping permanently changed American law enforcement. It revolutionized forensic science and directly led to the Federal Kidnapping Act. But beneath the media frenzy and historical milestones, it remains the tragic story of a murdered child.